So, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. You know, this is a vivid, it's rather tragic, and it's a haunting passage that has always captivated me in the Bible. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those sent to you. How often have I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing. And you know, all the vivid details aside, I think this passage sticks so much in my mind because of the tone in which Jesus is speaking here, particularly the fact that Jesus is the one speaking in this tone. And there's this edge of quiet desperation, I think, inside the grief expressed in this passage. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. It's the desperation of a parent who just cannot think of anything else to try, or perhaps is even beyond that point. You know, a parent who, at least deep down, knows there is nothing left to try. That what has been done is indeed beyond remedy, that every avenue has been exhausted, and that the child is never going to change. But, you know, what happens then, right? Is there ever a time when the parent truly gives up on the child? And I obviously am not a parent, but the experiences I have with parents in my own life, both mine and those of others, parents don't give up. At least not easily. You know, I've been watching recently a lot of true crime documentaries, which has not been totally fantastic for my ability to sleep through the night. But, you know, what can I say? They're mesmerizing. They really are. And the parts that I actually find most fascinating in these documentaries are the reactions of the families, not the families of the victims, but the families of the people who did these things. You know, people, parents, siblings, really close friends of the perpetrators of these horrendous acts, people who maybe just got themselves into a situation there was no way out of, but more often than not, when everything's laid out, all the facts are laid out, there's something wrong with these people. They may actually clinically and diagnostically fit somewhere in the sociopath or psychopath territory, people who are unable to empathize with other human beings and who are therefore, because of their own broken psychology, see other people as disposable things. But even in these extreme cases, the healthy people in these stories, the families, the parents, the siblings, over and over again, I see that even when it comes to these worst possible examples of humanity on this earth, you know, these bonds, the blood relationships and the close, long time friendships, they're never actually broken. And in watching enough of these documentaries, I have probably watched too many over the last few months, but in watching enough of these documentaries, I begin to notice that these patterns emerge, particularly in these family members. And I think the families of the criminals tend to fall into three categories that I've identified anyway. There is first the category of family members who will just never accept the truth. People who spend years or decades, entire lifetimes, either maintaining that their family member is in fact innocent, even despite all the overwhelming evidence to the contrary, or who, you know, they know their family member is guilty, but they find ways to justify and rationalize what has been done. And sometimes they even go so far as to help cover up or become somehow complicit in the crime itself. And then there are two categories of family members who do accept the truth about what's going on. You have those family members who accept the truth and cannot move on from it, who are haunted by it forever, who cut off all ties with the criminal family member who will never see them again, who cut off ties with family members who do not cut off ties with that person. And I actually do not think this is an example of the bond between family dissolving. I think this is not an example of families actually giving up on their criminal elements. I think this is what happens when that bond does in fact remain and it becomes a poison, one that cannot be walked away from. And then there's another example, though, of how this can play out. The other category of families who do accept the truth about their loved one. They're the family members who see what happened, who acknowledge reality, who try to understand without justifying or covering anything up, and who also do maintain whatever degree of contact is healthy with that family member. And these are the people who do ultimately move on with their lives. You know, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets. Now, which of these categories, the parent, the family member, watching a criminal child, which of these categories does Jesus fall into here when he speaks of the tragedy of Jerusalem? Now, this passage here, this is not an isolated expression in the Bible. This same sentiment, it does recur. It is spoken by God again and again and again. And to prove it, I have a whole list here, which I got from searching for just one phrase of several phrases I could have, but I just searched one phrase related to this passage. And what I mean by that is, because we are in this time of Lent, renewed Bible study, renewed devotion, however you want to look at it, for anyone who doesn't know, there are these online Bible databases that are fantastic. First of all, they have every single translation ever translated, English and other languages, including the original Hebrew and Greek texts, and they're also totally searchable, right? So you can search a word or a phrase, and it will pull up every single verse in the Bible that contains that word or phrase. The Bible database that I use, there are a few ones. The one I use is called Bible Gateway. It's free. And if any of you, have ever wondered maybe why I don't carry a physical copy of the Bible, first of all, I should. Like, that is a habit I should get into. I only have 20 of them at home that I could bring with me. But the reason I've fallen out of the habit of bringing one with me is that I have digital copies. First of all, I have like 2 on this device itself. But on my phone, I have an app to Bible Gateway, a direct link to that database. And it really is a fantastic tool for reading and studying the Bible. So anyway, that's the commercial break is over. We'll get back to the point now of, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Like I said, this is not an isolated expression in the Bible. Now, the same sentiment does recur numerous times. And to prove it, here is a list of honorable mentions. Just a few of what I found just from the prophets. That is that long collection of books at the end of the Old Testament. And it is just from me going to that database, Bible Gateway, and searching just one phrase. And that phrase was, return to me. And so here's the list of honorable mentions. We have Isaiah 55:7. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, and he will have mercy on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. As Jeremiah 15:19, therefore thus says the Lord, if you return, then I will bring you back. You shall stand before me if you take out the precious from the vile. Joel 2:13, so rend your heart, not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness, and he relents from doing harm. Zechariah 1:3, therefore say to them, thus says the Lord of hosts, return to me, thus says the Lord of hosts. And I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. Zechariah was really adamant that we understand the Lord of hosts was saying that. Jeremiah 3:7. And I said, after she had done these things, return to me. But she did not return. Now, Malachi 3:7, yet from the days of our fathers you have gone away from my ordinances, and you have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. But you said, in what way shall we return? Now, again, these are just the honorable mentions. They are far from the only results that came up in my search. They are only results from the prophets. I didn't look at any of the other books that came up in the search results. And they are only the passages that in one particular English translation, the New King James translation, literally contained the words, return to and me. So this idea of God who is desperate to gather humanity under the protection of God's wings. This is not an isolated idea. Humanity being the barrier between humanity and God, the side of the relationship that is unwilling to grow or compromise or work on the relationship, that is not an isolated idea. The whole wing thing isn't even an isolated metaphor. God's wings show up occasionally in the Bible. But I do think that this example here in our passage this morning, this example of the ongoing theme is particularly gripping. Because in every other example, God is speaking through a human filter. Remember Zechariah saying over and over again, the Lord is saying this. Usually that human filter is a prophet, but it's always a person, in the Old Testament especially. Here we have Jesus physically in our world, looking down the road toward the real city that is used in many ways in the Bible to represent all of humanity in our relationship with God, and saying, one more time, please just come back to me. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets. How often have I wanted to gather you under my wings as a hen gathers her brood. Yet you were not willing. And so because humanity will not, it is in fact Jesus, it is God who returns himself to humanity and to Jerusalem ultimately. And that is, spoiler alert, what this journey in Lent, this season before Easter, ultimately this is what it's meant to reveal to us. That unwilling and unable to return to God, God always returns to us, no matter what. And that on God's side, that bond is never broken. Now this passage, O Jerusalem, is, it appears in 2 of the 4 Gospels. It's pretty much, I think it's actually identical in both versions. It appears in Luke, which is the version we read this morning, and it also appears in Matthew. And the passage we read from Matthew this morning is actually the beginning of a chapter 23, which ends with that passage, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem. And we read the beginning of Matthew 23 today because, how this lament over Jerusalem begins, it is important in both of the Gospels, how it is introduced. So in Luke gives us sort of the historical context, I think we could say, for how Jesus comes to speak this lament over Jerusalem. We're told that he is on his way, or he is planning, or he is in the vicinity of Jerusalem, and he's running into trouble with the authorities, as happens throughout his preaching career, right? And so as he is in the vicinity of Jerusalem here, or preparing to go to Jerusalem, this group of people comes and tells him, don't do that. Get out of here. you're not safe. And to that, Jesus' response is, yeah, no, of course it's not safe. It's never been safe for prophets, for teachers, for people God calls and sends with messages that humanity does not want to hear, especially when they go up, as usually happens, against kings like Herod. No, of course it's not safe. It's just what must be done. It's what I must do, because I am the mother who will never give up on her children. And that bond will never be broken by me, by God, by Jesus. Now, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Now, in Matthew 23, we have a more, I'd say, thematic context for Jesus' lament here. What we have here is a list, really, of the actual behaviors that do get between humanity and God. Beyond the dramatic extremes of killing prophets and stoning messengers, Matthew 23 first explains this slippery slope of more ordinary evils that lead eventually to the killing of prophets and the stoning of messengers, and ultimately lead to humanity reaching this point of no return, at which time our only hope is for God to actually return to us instead. And this whole chapter in Matthew 23, it struck me this week as the reverse of another much more famous passage. Now, you all are familiar with the Beatitudes, right? It's this list. It's also in Matthew. It's blessed are the humble, the peacemakers, etc. And Matthew 23 is actually the inverse of that list. It's the list instead of things not to be and not to do. Beatitudes is this list of behaviors and mindsets that are healthy to cultivate in order to develop that relationship with God and also just be good people in the world. Matthew 23 is the list of behaviors and mindsets that get in the way of returning to God and taking shelter under God's wings. And I'm calling it the way of woes, as in, woe to you, Pharisees, hypocrites. The Beatitudes, the recurring introductory line is, blessed are thee. And here the recurring line is, woe to you, hypocrites, teachers, Pharisees. Now, we didn't read that list this morning, to be clear, in case anyone's wondering if they missed something. We did not read that list. We read the introduction to the list, where Jesus is telling of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. The Pharisees, this group which, for better or worse, deserved or not, have gone down in history as synonymous with hypocrisy. In reality, I'm sure they weren't all evil or hypocritical. They're actually probably the origins of the rabbis today, modern Jewish rabbis. And in fact, several of Jesus' followers were Pharisees. Jesus' own teaching aligns more closely to the general teachings of the Pharisees than to any other religious group at his time, including the Sadducees, who controlled the temple in Jerusalem. And in fact, that's kind of the point of this passage here in Matthew 23, isn't it? Jesus is saying that the teachings of the Pharisees are indeed correct, that they occupy a place of authority for good reason in religion, Moses' seat, he calls it, and that authority is to be respected. Respect their authority, Jesus says, accept their teachings even, but don't do what they do. Do as I say, not as I do, right? And that is, of course, where the hypocrisy of it all does come in. The hypocrisy being the number one problem that Jesus points to throughout all four Gospels. Hypocrisy does seem, at least in Jesus' teachings, to be the main barrier between humanity and God. And I think that makes a lot of sense, really, because deep down on a fundamental level, I think all humans do know the difference, this very basic difference between right and wrong. Every documented culture throughout history has come up with essentially the same legal code, eventually. The 10 Commandments, particularly the second half of the 10 Commandments, the thou shalt not murder, steal, break your word, abuse other people, etc., those really are universal human values. And when it comes down to it, I don't think our biggest difficulty as humans is in knowing the actual difference between right and wrong. I think our biggest difficulty as humans is just rigorously applying what we know as the difference between right and wrong to ourselves and to our own lives and our families. And that, of course, is hypocrisy, a different standard for ourselves than for others, or even just a different standard for ourselves than the universal standard that we do know to be true. Now, of course, there's a lot of nuance, and different cultures express all these values in different ways, and that can be discussed literally forever. But basically, we all do know the difference between right and wrong. We just don't always apply it to ourselves. And what really struck me when I was reading through the Way of Woes here in Matthew 23 is how, just like the 10 Commandments and also like the Beatitudes, the woe-tos list is pretty universal. It struck me how applicable all of these limiting behaviors really are to every age and to every group. How easy it is for any age and any group or any human to fall into these things and allow them to become barriers or stumbling blocks in our lives. And so that is what I plan to talk about as I am trying to get in this habit on Lent of posting weekly online. I'm going to be talking on Thursdays about this way of woes. In this Lenten time of self-reflection and growth, let's take a look and see what might apply here. So then the point for me, again, in this Way of Woes study, what I'm calling it, it's largely, again, to get in that habit of posting every week. And Lent seems like an opportune time to develop church habits anyway. So if you have time on your own Lenten journey, stop by, check it out. But what I really want to leave you with this morning, though, as we move on to their next song here, is this image of God as the protector, as the nurturer, as the mother. Usually he's referred to as father, but this particular metaphor is indeed female. And it's not the only one in the Bible either. Again, nothing in this passage is unprecedented in the Bible. But on your Lenten journey in the next weeks, particularly if you do choose to embark on the Way of Woes with me on Thursdays, take some comfort and strength in that image, in the image of the parent who never gives up, the mother who is always there and waiting to give shelter, the bond of family that no matter what, never actually breaks. Because God, our Creator, is the origin of all life and of all love and of all family. And God is indeed softly and tenderly calling. So we move on to 348 in the hymnals, our next song this morning.